There are things a man carries for years that never make it into a song. Not because he cannot find the words, but because some truths feel too dangerous to speak out loud. Vince Gill has spent his entire adult life turning pain into music. But there was one chapter he kept locked away. One chapter he never let journalists near, never hinted at in interviews, and never gave fans even a sliver of access to. That changed recently. At 68, with more life behind him than ahead, Vince Gill finally broke his silence, and what he revealed about his wife Amy Grant stunned even the people closest to him. But he did not speak from a stage or a press release. He spoke the way a tired man finally speaks when he realizes the weight of silence has become heavier than the weight of truth. He said had been warned, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, serious way that people warn you when they believe you might not be strong enough for what comes next. He listened to Toto's warnings for years. Then he decided he was done listening. People who follow Vince Gill's career have always sensed something underneath the calm, that he performs with an ease that looks effortless. But anyone who has ever studied his eyes during a slow song knows there is grief stored somewhere behind them. That grief did not come from nowhere. It came from decades of watching the people he loved most get pulled away from him, sometimes slowly, sometimes without warning, always without his permission. That T.O. understand what Vince revealed about Amy. You first have to understand what loss did to him long before Amy Grant ever walked into his life. He was 11 years old when his older brother Bob was in a devastating car accident. One phone call changed everything in the Gill household. Bob survived, but the brother Vince knew before that night never fully came back. Bob could no longer speak the way he used to. He could not care for himself the way he said to. He existed in a damaged state for 25 years before he passed away in 1993. Vince watched his father go quiet in the way that men of that generation went quiet when they had no other choice. He watched his mother cry through walls she thought were thick enough to muffle grief. And he learned something in those years that most children never have to learn. He learned that losing someone does not always require a funeral. Sometimes the person is right there beside you, and they are still gone. That wound never healed. Vince carried it through every stage of his career, through every album, through every award ceremony where he smiled for cameras while something inside him stayed raw. When he eventually retreated into music during those years, it was not a romantic choice. It was survival. Music was the only place where the weight did not follow him through the door. His early career tested him in ways the public rarely understood. By the late 1980s, Nashville had very little room for artists who refused to chase radio trends. Vince had enormous respect from other musicians. He worked as a session player, contributed to other people's records, and led Pure Prairie League for a stretch. But respect for musicians and recognition from the public are two completely different currencies. And he had plenty of the first while struggling badly for the second. There were nights where the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be felt impossible to close. There were bills that stacked up quietly while friends around him were landing headline tours and television appearances. What most people don't know is that during this difficult stretch, he was offered a way out that most musicians would never be brave enough to refuse. Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits, one of the biggest rock acts in the world at the time, offered him a permanent spot in the band. It meant financial security. It meant packed arenas. It meant walking away from the uncertainty that had defined his career for years. Vince nearly said yes. He admitted later that desperation almost made the decision for him. But something stopped him. He believed that if he took that road, the musician he was still trying to become would disappear. He turned the offer down and paid for it immediately with smaller gigs, reduced income, and the particular kind of doubt that comes from watching your only lifeline sail away. Then came When I Call Your Name. The song arrived the way the most honest songs always do, born out of real feeling, with no attempt to manufacture emotion for the sake of a hit. When listeners heard it, something in the song recognized them back. Radio stations that had passed over him suddenly could not get enough. The Grammy that followed did not just represent an award. It represented the moment the world finally caught up to what Nashville insiders had known for years. Vince Gill was not just talented, he was essential. But even at the height of that recognition, His private life was moving in directions that would soon become impossible to contain. He met Amy Grant in 1993 while filming a Christmas special. Neither of them went looking for what happened next. Both were married to other people, and both of them understood what that meant. The connection that formed between them was not something either of them could easily explain or easily ignore. It grew across shared performances and collaborative moments, and by the time either of them acknowledged it privately, the public had already started noticing. The fallout was brutal. Amy bore the sharpest edge of it. Radio stations that had built their playlists around her music suddenly refused to play it. Fans who had followed her career for decades felt betrayed. Letters arrived full of anger and disappointment from people who had connected her music to their own faith and felt that she had violated something sacred. Vince took hits too, but Amy's were deeper because her career had always been so publicly tied to values that her audience now felt she had abandoned. He watched her cry on nights when the weight of other people's judgment became too heavy to stand under. He held her and felt helpless and stayed anyway. They married in 2000 quietly in his backyard, with only the people closest to them present. They did not want a spectacle. They wanted peace. What followed was not a fairy tale, but it was real. Two people who had survived the worst of public judgment trying to build something honest together. Then in 2016, Glenn Frey died, and Vince's life shifted in a direction he never saw coming. He had always loved the Eagles. He had covered their songs, absorbed their harmonies, and held Glenn's voice in a place of deep personal respect. When Irving Azoff called and asked him to step into that role, Vince's first reaction was disbelief, and his second was fear. The weight of what he was being asked to do landed hard. He would be standing on stages singing songs that belonged to a man who could never sing them again. He prepared for it the only way he knew how, obsessively and completely. He learned every note, every breath, every transition until the music was no longer something he was performing, but something he was inhabiting. The response from fans and from Don Henley himself confirmed what Vince had hoped but never assumed. He had honored Glenn the right way, but none of that prepared him for what was waiting at home at in 2020. During a routine medical visit, Amy's doctors found something that rearranged everything. She had a rare congenital heart defect that had gone undetected for years. The technical name was partial anomalous pulmonary venous return. The required treatment was open heart surgery. Vince sat in the room when the doctor explained it, and he stared at the wall, because looking at Amy meant showing her the fear he was not ready to show her yet. The pandemic made the situation even more isolating. Hospital rules kept him out of the spaces where he desperately wanted to be. He waited alone for hours in corridors that reminded him of every waiting room he had ever sat in as a child. All those years ago, when Bob was in the hospital and the adults around him whispered behind closed doors. What Vince revealed recently was something he had never told anyone during that time. While Amy was in surgery, a doctor pulled him aside and told him directly that there was a real possibility she might not survive the operation. He told no one. He kept that information locked inside because he did not want panic spreading to the people who loved her before the surgery was even finished. He sat with that knowledge alone, praying in the quiet way a man prays when he has no other tool available to him. Every minute that passed was a test of whether he could hold himself together long enough to be there for her when it was over. Amy survived. The recovery was long and hard in ways that were not visible from the outside. She was exhausted for months. Her memory was inconsistent. Her balance took time to return. Vince watched every change with the careful attention of someone who had already lost a version of a person they loved once before and was not willing to miss the signs again. Then in July 2022, Amy went on a bike ride in Nashville. Vince was not with her. He got a phone call telling him she had crashed and was unconscious. His body reacted before his mind had fully processed the words. He drove to the hospital shaking, and when he arrived, the doctors told him she had suffered a traumatic brain injury. She had been unconscious for several minutes. The potential complications included memory loss, balance problems, and cognitive effects that could last months or longer. No one could tell him with confidence how much would return. What he witnessed during her recovery from that accident is the part he struggled most to talk about. Amy's memory worked differently afterward. Some gaps lasted weeks. Some lasted months. There were moments she could not hold onto a thought she had just had. There were nights where she looked at him with the expression of someone searching for something just out of reach. One night she turned to him and asked quietly whether she had already told him she loved him that day or whether she had forgotten again. That question, he said, broke something open in him. Because she was still there. She was entirely there. And yet parts of her were rearranging themselves in ways neither of them had chosen. That he admitted that during those months, he thought seriously about walking away from music entirely. Not in the way that people say it when they want to seem devoted. He meant it in the plainest possible way. He would have stopped performing, stopped touring, and stopped writing if caring for her full-time had required that. Music had been his identity since he was a boy sitting beside his father with a guitar. But she came first. She had always come first even when he did not say it out loud. The truth Vince Gill finally put into words at 68 was this. His greatest fear was never death. Death is final, and in its own brutal way, it is honest. What frightened him more was watching Amy remain alive while pieces of who she was slipped away quietly, the way his brother had slipped away all those decades ago. The parallel was not lost on him. He had lived this specific kind of grief before. He had learned as a child that you could lose someone without losing them completely, and that this particular kind of loss had no clean ending and no moment where you were allowed to stop being afraid at your bedside during recovery. He made a promise he had never spoken publicly until now. He said that if she never came back fully to the woman he had known, he would love whoever she became. Not as a consolation, not as a compromise, as a choice made freely by a man who understood that love is not a feeling that requires the other person to stay exactly the same in order to keep being real. Amy Grant has continued to recover. She has spoken about her own journey with characteristic openness and faith. She performed again. She showed up again. And Vince has been exactly where he said he would be, steady, present, and unwilling to look away. Recent searches around Vince Gill and Amy Grant have spiked significantly, with fans searching for Amy Grant Health Update 2024, Amy Grant Brain Injury Recovery, Vince Gill Eagles Tour 2024, and Amy Grant Return to Performing. The public fascination with their story has only grown as more details have emerged, and Vince's decision to finally speak openly has given that fascination something real to hold on to. This is not a celebrity story about scandal or spectacle. It is a story about a man who spent his life learning how to carry grief and finally found the courage to set some of it down where others could see it. He said once that the songs he is writing now are not the ones that will top the charts. They are the ones that matter. At 68, after everything he has witnessed and survived and held silently for years, that distinction makes complete sense. The man who turned down dire straits to stay true to himself, who carried the memory of his brother through every stage of his career, who stood in a hospital hallway knowing his wife might not survive and told no one, that man has earned the right to decide what matters. And what he has decided is this. Truth matters more than comfort. Presence matters more than performance. And love, the kind that does not require the other person to stay unchanged, is the only kind worth fighting for.